Good evening. I'm Nigel Redden, the General Director of Spoleto Festival USA, and I want to welcome you to the fourth conversation in our series Exploring Omar. Omar ibn Saeed will be the protagonist of an opera also named Omar, which will premiere at Spoleto Festival USA in May of this year, with a libretto by Rhiannon Giddens and co-composed by Rhiannon Giddens and Michael Abels. The protagonist, Omar, was captured at the age of 37 in what is now Senegal, taken to Charleston, where he was sold in 1807. In 1831, he wrote his autobiography in Arabic, while still enslaved. He was brought up as a Muslim, as were as many as 30% of the Africans who were enslaved in the United States. So this evening, to talk about religion, resilience, and resistance is the most appropriate topic. I want to thank all the panelists who are joining us, who will be introduced by our moderator, Hussein Rashid. Hussein has followed the project from when it was simply an idea and is an authority on Muslims in colonial America and in the early years of the Republic. So to you, Hussein, thank you for moderating.
Thank you for that kind introduction, Nigel, and thank you all for joining us this evening for what promises to be a wonderful conversation in the series Exploring Omar, Spiritual Struggles, Religion as Resilience and Resistance. Just as we're getting warmed up, for those of you who are logged into YouTube and can use the chat function, we'd love to hear where you're from, and if you're so inclined, please share your New Year's resolution with us all. Just to get you started, I'm on Lenape-Hawking, the land traditionally stewarded by the Lenape people in Manhattan, specifically in Harlem. And my resolution is to not watch so much TV this year. As I begin to introduce the panelists, I am only introducing them in the briefest of ways. They are amazing individuals, and were I to take the time to tell you all the things that they've done, we'd be here till dawn. So with that, please, I encourage you to go and look them up after this program so you can find out about all the great things that they're doing out in the world. First up, I'd like to introduce Rabbi Yossi Refson of the Chabad of Charleston. Greetings, Yossi.
Thank you.
Next is Dr. Youssef Carter, Assistant Professor and Kenan Rifai Fellow in Islamic Studies at UNC. Greetings, Youssef.
Greetings. Thank you.
And Reverend DeMett Jenkins, Lilly Director of Education and Engagement for Faith-Based Communities at the International African American Museum. Greetings, DeMett.
Greetings, everyone. Thank you.
So as we begin this conversation about religion and resilience, I want us to think a little bit about broadly how religion functions in the United States and how religion gets counted as having meaning. So there's a rhetoric of religious freedom in this country. And examples of this, as an example of this, people often point to George Washington's letter to the Hebrew congregation of Newport, Rhode Island. And the line that often gets quoted from this letter is that the US government gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance. At the same time that Washington is saying that the US government does not support bigotry, the country, with government approval, is practicing race-based chattel slavery, which is a very clear expression of bigotry. And so this dissonance raises a series of questions for me. Is religious liberty distinct and separate from a general sense of liberty? Are race and religion connected in some way in US history? And are only certain races allowed to have religion protected by the nation? So these are some of the overarching questions that are in my mind as I turn to each of you to begin our conversation. And Yossi, I'd like to begin with you, if you don't mind, and just have you ground us a little bit, especially for me, somebody who's not from Charleston. Give us a brief history, if you could, about the history of the Chabad of Charleston and the broader South.
So, thank you, Dr. Rashid. Chabad of Charleston was founded in 2007, and that for a city like Charleston that has a very long and rich history, that's a fledgling Jewish organization. Jews were in Charleston in the early 1600s. In the middle 1600s, Jews were, as they fled persecution in England. There were Spanish Jews who had fled the Inquisition in Portugal and Spain and had made their way to London, and then eventually making their way to South Carolina and to Charleston. And one of the reasons was that was similarly to what you had mentioned, that in the fundamentalist constitution of South Carolina, it was liberty of conscience to all settlers, Jews and heathens and dissenters. The Jews felt somewhat welcome because of that, which now that we would probably frown on that type of language, but back then that was a welcome mat for Jews to come to South Carolina. And in the 1700s, in 1740, when the Spanish invasion of Georgia took place, considerably more Jews. The Jews of Georgia fled Georgia because they were worried about a second Inquisition, and they settled in South Carolina. So South Carolina has a wonderful, rich Jewish history, and there's one of the earliest synagogues, KKBE, is in Charleston, which was originally a Sephardic synagogue, and now is a Reformed temple. But there was a time when the Jerusalem of Jewry in the diaspora, that Charleston was considered that. In one of the early founding memos of KKBE, there was this language which the first rabbi said that we don't need Jerusalem, that Charleston is our Jerusalem and Charleston is our Palestine. Somewhat that this will be the new, because of how welcome Jews felt in the South. And Chabad has a very history. Was founded in the 1700s, in 1775 in Lithuania, and it was founded on the principles of equality, of spiritual equality, of looking at every person as their soul. In those days, religious practice was very much restricted by knowledge and class. And the Hasidic movement and Chabad tried to erode those boundaries and looking at the heart and soul of every single person and recognizing that there is inherent equality as we are all created in the image of God, regardless of the person's knowledge, regardless of the person's observance. That was really the theme which trickled down to the current Chabad movement, which is the largest organization. It's actually the second largest Jewish organization. The largest Jewish organization is the State of Israel. And the second largest Jewish organization is Chabad, which has over 3,500 centers in 100 countries. But what's unique about Chabad is that in each organization, each location is independent from the mothership. So it's run by a husband and wife, usually a husband and wife, who are directors and co-directors, and they find a spot where there's no Chabad, they start a Chabad. And in 2007, we came here to start Chabad in Charleston.
And thank you, Yossi, for that wonderful history. How has building the community in Charleston been going? And is it still the hope that you mentioned from the 1740s?
So Charleston is a very unique community. It's a special community, but a unique community. So some would ask, so Chabad has all these branches all over the world. There's branches in Columbia, South Carolina, in Myrtle Beach, in Greenville. Why didn't Charleston have a Chabad only until a mere 12, 13 years ago? And the reason is because Chabad always looks for places where the need is the greatest. And because Charleston had such a rich and deep history with 3 congregations and charitable organizations and its own day school, it wasn't an obvious need until more recently, as Judaism started to change in the United States, where affiliation dwindles, people don't necessarily practice because their parents practice. So it takes more of an outreach type of organization to try and strengthen, to shore up the walls which surround the Jewish tradition, Jewish faith.
Great, thank you. So continuing our move into a more modern period, what does Jewish social activism in Charleston look like? How do you see people bringing their religion into social activist spaces, which has really been, social activism has been such a concern over the last year. Obviously longer, but it's really been on people's minds in the last year.
Right. So social activism and Judaism go somewhat hand in hand. There is this social activism is deeply embedded into the Jewish psyche, going all the way back to some of the original scriptures, like in Exodus, you shall not mistreat a stranger because you were strangers in the land of Egypt yourself. And just the settings, for example, in the religious tradition, this idea that Sinai followed the revelation at Sinai, where the Jewish people became a nation, followed the slavery of Egypt, was intentional. In order that to truly be a nation, to take ethical monotheism to the next level, it takes having experienced suffering. So really, social activism has become a very important part of Jewish life. You know, there was a Pew study in 2013, which I found quite surprising, that they were asked Jews, what did it mean to be Jewish? And the only thing which was beat it, was the most common answer was working for justice and equality. That was the Jewish value. The only thing that beat that was having a good sense of humor. But that was so it just seems to be baked in the Jewish psyche, this idea. So in Charleston, every Jewish organization have elements of activism and social justice work. But if you really look at Jews and social justice organizations, Jews are very involved, each and every one of them, in many of them, and it hasn't necessarily taken on that Jews create their own social justice organizations in each town, but they join the existing organizations and try and lend their efforts to those as well.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction to the community and to the history of Charleston. Youssef, turning to you, a similar question. Could you give us sort of a brief background about the history of Muslims in Charleston and the broader South?
Thank you, Hussein. I was wondering if I might actually approach the questions that you asked earlier about religious liberty being separate and distinct from a general, as well as race and religion. Just because I think it's important, particularly in this moment, but generally speaking. And so I want to say that I'm not sure what we actually mean when we use a term like liberty. I'm not clear, mainly because the manner in which we use the term doesn't seem to match how it's been deployed over the past few centuries. Liberty for all has actually meant liberty for some. Notions of liberty were initially only thought to be naturally dispensed to citizens, white, male, landowning. And meanwhile, people who look like me, my ancestors, right, struggled to be recognized as human and not property. Even the notion that in a sort of more modern sense, that one would have to utter a phrase like Black Lives Matter means that there is a vital and profound rupture between certain ideals about liberty versus what people actually experience. Ideally, notions of liberty should be articulated, I would think, in such a way that considers those without power and the most vulnerable. However, the idea of liberty or liberties, freedoms, rights, etc., seem to be unquestionably for the powerful. Another thing to note, and I think this is part of what we're seeing unfold in our present electoral politics, is that ideas about liberty are understood as entitlements to behave or speak in whatever manner that we desire, as opposed to ideals that are informed by the common good. Liberties are therefore individual and not collective. The individual prospers at the expense of the common good without any regard for what is ethical, right? And so scholars have argued that religious liberty has only been offered for most of US history to those whose faith traditions were intelligible to a white Judeo-Christian perspective, right? And so this is why those religious traditions that were not recognized as valid were deemed cults. I mean, forget being a Muslim or a practitioner of Yoruba, Santeria, Condomble, or even Jewish. There was a time when being Catholic in this country was a problem. For some people, it still is, right? So I would say, no, these are not, in my mind, distinct and separate, right? They're tied together and perhaps informed by a broader misapplication of liberties. And so with regard to the question of race and religion, I think they've been very much connected throughout the history of the United States. Most of us understand that one of the most, if not the most enduring problems that we have in this country is racism. And what I mean by that is not merely interpersonal racism, but structural racism. Right? That is a kind of differential treatment based on racist thought that is embedded in all of the institutions that structure everyday life here. Most of us know that this is a problem, but many don't recognize how religion or religious discourse has been used to prop up racist thought. And so religion and religious discourse has been quite instrumental in racial formation, or what I mean by that is the formation of racist thought. So turning to the question of, the history of Muslims in Charleston and the broader South, well, the history of Muslims in Charleston and the broader South mirrors that of the nation's Islamic history at large, right? The earliest Muslim presence in the United States is found amongst enslaved Africans who were forcibly migrated during the Middle Passage and were largely brought to serve as free labor on plantations. As Nigel, at the outset of this program, during his introduction, mentions, upwards of 30% of enslaved Africans who were forced to labor in what is now the United States were Muslim. And so they were instrumental in resisting their enslavement through insurrection or escape, but mostly, I would say, through maintaining their faith in some configuration. Many sought to practice the parts of their religion that they could, in spite of chattel enslavement, right? Charleston was a major port of entry for enslaved people, and according to the International African American Museum, nearly 80% of African Americans today can potentially trace an ancestor who arrived in Charleston, right? And so there's way too much history to share here, but I'll just say that throughout the antebellum period, most Muslims in the US were of African descent, right? The 20th, particularly the mid-20th century, is when we see more South Asian, North African, and Arab Muslims entering the country in large swaths due to changes in federal immigration policy. And so even the American Muslim Ummah or community becomes way more ethnically diverse after that point. And so turning to Omar ibn Said, really quickly, we consider one of those early Muslim pioneers in the US who was able to leave his mark, quite literally. He was taken from his home in what is now Senegal, brought into the US through Charleston, escaped from bondage in South Carolina, crossed into North Carolina, and was recaptured there. He became a controversial, notable figure by the mere fact that he could read and write in Arabic, like many other Muslims in the broader West African region were educated to do. And so, yeah.
Well, thank you. I mean, I think you've picked up exactly the thread that I was hoping that somebody would, which is how do we see this connection between race and religion and the ways in which it is not equally applied, and liberty and I often phrase it as rights without responsibility when we talk about liberty. And I think Omar is an interesting case study because he is both in terms of how he's perceived and how he's written about is partially valorized because he has access to writing, right? This is part of the thing that brings him across the level, which is brought through his religious education, right. But nobody necessarily knows what to do with that. Obviously, there have been other Muslims who, prior to Omar, who have also gained some notoriety in the U.S. context. Perhaps most notably, one who was described as Prince, and there was a documentary about him called Prince Among Slaves. Right. Where he was told to write the Lord's Prayer in Arabic, and often he would write a chapter of the Quran or a verse from the Quran to do this. But that what we understand from these stories is that often they would say, we're not Black Africans, we are Moorish, we are dark-skinned Arabs, so that there's a sort of a racial pecking order even in the early part of the country that allows some of these individuals to leverage these identities to gain more rights and liberties for themselves, if not outright freedom in some instances. But as far as we can tell with Omar, he never went that route. He was quite affirming of his background, both racially and religiously. He was very open and direct about it. But we also understand, again, elements of his autobiography lead people to believe that he converted. And other people writing about him contemporaneously argue that he converted. Contemporaneously with Omar, not in the contemporary period, arguing that he converted. So what do we really know about Omar's religious life? And does conversion mean what we think it means?
Yeah, great questions. So I think what we do know about Omar's life, about his religious life, is that he was a practicing Muslim from Futa Toro, a region that is now part of Senegal, right? We know that his ability to quote and write portions of the Quran, as well as components of religious legal thought in Arabic, means that he was educated. And so as a result of his being enslaved in the United States, he was placed in an environment that was predominantly Christian. And he was faced with the dilemma of having to navigate the politics of being a religious minority in an environment where race and religion figure prominently, and where religious liberty, as it were, is not really a thing for someone considered property, right? And thus does not qualify to have their inalienable rights recognized. And so as far as the question of conversion, I'm not sure where to start on this one, but many of us tend to think of conversion as some clean or sudden break with one faith and a simple entry into another, right? And the reality is that things aren't that simple, even under normal conditions, right? There's the question of practice, and then there's the question of faith, right? And so during the time of Omar ibn Said, right, a significant portion of people living on this side of the world were enslaved, right? They were made to labor and serve. But did they actually believe that they should be property and were inherently less valuable than those who enslaved them? Similarly, let's remember that in the context that we are talking about, enslaved Africans who were, in most cases, compelled to profess the faith of the people who violently oppressed them, right? We're talking about conditions of profound and ubiquitous violence, right? As two of my colleagues, Mbailo and Carl Ernst, Mbailo's at Duke University, Carl Ernst is at UNC Chapel Hill. They assert in a recent article in the Muslim World Journal, the subtitle of which is actually The Eloquence of Resilience, right? They assert that reports of Omar ibn Said's conversion to Christianity was more likely a consequence of a missionary ideology on the part of those who were invested in the idea of a white man's burden, right? To sell the idea that slavery was actually a civilizing mission rather than an artifact of racial capitalism. Even the popular photograph of Omar ibn Said shown at the outset of this program was a construction, a representation of some sort of kind enslavement, right, in its capacity to reform and redeem heathen Africans who purportedly had no culture, no history, no civilization, by inviting them into the world of humanity. Right. And so in my mind, perhaps it's better to view Omar ibn Said as a hostage, right, who on one hand was used as a prop within a broader religious ideology that was structured by racist thought. And on the other hand, was someone who used the prospect of religious conversion as a strategy to navigate otherwise impossible conditions. One of the things that they sort of talk about in their article is that that there's not much evidence of Said talking in first person about his newfound faith, right? I actually have it here. I'll read verbatim really quickly. They say available evidence indicates that his connection to Christianity was only through performance, not intellectual conviction, right? Unlike his old Muslim faith, in which he kept strong written evidence, we have few biblical inscriptions from him, right? Furthermore, they say that in 1853, right, Omar ibn Said wrote a letter to John Tyler, who was the first Chief Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court, in which he declares that, quote unquote, God is only with Allah, no one else. Praise be to Allah who created the creation to worship him so he can judge their deeds and words, end quote. That was written 3 years after the photograph of him was taken, 10 years before his death in 1863.
And I think as you're talking about how people viewed, right, this missionary mindset and the civilizing mission mindset, I think it's about reading what people necessarily want, because if one actually does read the autobiography, Omar does talk about Jesus, but he doesn't talk about Jesus necessarily as in a way that is definitively theologically Christian, right? And I think this is what gets lost sometimes, is that, of course, Muslims do look at Jesus as a prophetic figure. There's a strong tradition of veneration of Jesus within Muslim traditions. And there are ways in which you can approach praise of prophetic figures without necessarily crossing Muslim theological boundaries. And I think that often gets lost in some of these conversations. And the ways in which it feels like Omar is really threading a needle in terms of what he's saying, as you said, and in terms of practice. And we have an image of a sign. So, Youssef, I don't know if you want to speak to this image a little bit.
Yeah, so we have sort of a historical plaque, and this is in Fayetteville, right? An historical plaque of Omar ibn Saeed, sort of noting his historical presence and who he was, next to sort of a prominent signage of a mosque that was named after him, right, in Fayetteville, North Carolina, Masjid Omar ibn Saeed, right? And the mosque is a predominantly African American, a mosque that is attended primarily by African American Muslims. So. And
I think we have a close-up of the plaque as well. And I think it's interesting how it ends, which is Omar, the last sentence is, lived in Bladen County and worshipped with local Presbyterians.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's you know, as I mentioned before, right, he's navigating an environment in which he is a religious minority. And I think it's important to sort of understand him as a hostage, right? And so what does it mean to have to endure and navigate through sort of a terrain in which your survival hinges upon your ability to adapt to the conditions on the ground, right? And so I'll also mention, going back to what you mentioned about sort of commentaries on Jesus, right? A very popular name amongst Muslims is Isa, right? Isa being an Arabic, the Arabic name for Jesus, right? And so there's a recognition of the importance of Jesus, the prophet, right, in Islam, amongst Muslims, and it should not be lost on those of us who can sort of read in between the lines, and not just read the words, but read what's not there, about you know, who Omar ibn Said was, and in terms of his sort of religious life.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point. I think sometimes silences can be deafening.
Yeah, also, I wanted to mention really quickly that most of the reports of his conversion, if not all of the reports of his conversion, happened via second and third hand, right? As opposed to a sort of first person account of his conversion. So I think that's also should be said.
Great. Thank you for that wonderful deep dive, both into the history of Omar, but also having us think a little bit more consciously about the ways religion and race are tied together. And I think, DeMett, something happened in the last couple of weeks with the recent election of Senator-elect Reverend Raphael Warnock, and obviously John Ossoff as well in Georgia. But for me, particularly with Reverend Warnock, there was something about the role of religion in U.S. society that kept coming up in that election fight. Reverend Warnock's opponent often attacked his understanding of Christianity, particularly in the runoff period. So in the period between November and when the runoff happened in early January. And her attacks, this is Senator Kelly Loeffler, her attacks echoed attacks on Black religion, which Youssef has already hinted at, but these attacks on Black religion that go back centuries. And so I think, first and foremost, I have a very basic question for you. Again, echoing what I've asked Yossi and Youssef, is if you could speak a little bit to what the history of Black churches in Charleston and the broader South. And I know it's a big ask, like I've asked for the two of them, but if you could just speak a little bit to that. Why do we talk about Black churches, and what is that significance there?
Well, you know, just that whole election, that runoff election process was just hard to watch because of just the anti-faith attacks on the Black church, and it really just somehow it got off of politics and it got on religion. They were stopped talking about what the Georgia community needed and who the people are. It got to a point where they were talking about Raphael Warnock's his sermon that he did 10 plus years ago, where his sermon was titled "When Truth Meets Power," But in that sermon, he was talking about the Matthew 6:24 verse where God doesn't want you to serve two masters. And so he was saying to people, listen, you can't serve God and the military. You can't serve God and money. And when they heard you can't serve God and the military, it just got distorted because they were trying to say that he was saying that the military were not good, that you shouldn't be in the military. And it was just all distorted and really compared him a lot to Martin Luther King in terms of calling him a socialist and, all these horrible things. And so it just got out of context. And so people just wanted to believe that he was saying the military was bad. And so when we talk about the Black church has always talked about politics. We've always gathered around in the sanctuary and talked about what's going on in the community, what we need to be aware of, what we need to be prepared for. That's not brand new. That if we want to go back in history, we can go back to our ancestors who even during enslavement had their opportunity in their faith houses to talk about what was going on, what was the politics of the time. So the Black church has always been historical to talk about what's now, what's present, and what's ahead. What do we need to look at? What do we need to forecast and be prepared for? And so that's not new to us. So that election process was just, it was just horrible in the sense that we stopped talking about the needs of the people, and we started talking about, having anti-faith attacks on faith in the Black church.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. With these comparisons to Martin Luther King, and I don't want to extend this point. I think it does a disservice to both King and Reverend Warnock. But at the same time, I think at least for me, it feels like Reverend Warnock is part of a longer history of Black prophetic voices engaging directly in politics, which you've already hinted at, right? But actually running for office, So I live on Adam Clayton Powell Jr. Boulevard in New York City, right? Reverend Adam Clayton Powell was his father. I mean, there's a history here. He was Jr. was a senator, very much involved in the civil rights movement, and so I'd just love to hear your thoughts about that prophetic voice in politics coming out of Black churches.
I think just what I just said a few minutes ago, politics in the church, that's not a new concept. I grew up in a small rural United Methodist church right here on Johns Island, right outside of Charleston. Every Sunday, both pastor and community leaders talked about politics, talked about elections, talked about voting, talked about our rights. That was every Sunday. So I grew up knowing that I needed to be aware of what was going on, and I needed to apply it to my life. I needed to be a part of any kind of community organizing. I knew that growing up. And so I don't think it's new that both you have politician and preacher. I think whether they were ordained to be or just called to be in the sense of that's who they were, that was already happening in the Black church. So I don't think that that's new. When I think about, all of these pastors and preachers, both men and women, that's from the beginning of time, so they didn't have to have an official ordination. But I think now that we're seeing more people really delving into politics and showing up not only on the community level, but the national level, like it's just part of who we are. It's in our DNA. It's what's been done from the beginning of time. It's what we've done during enslavement and beyond. So I think that it's an important place for us to be and to serve as senator and president and vice president and all of those political positions. I think it's an important place for us to be, because I think for the Black church preacher, we are the same person as a politician as we are the preacher. We are not over here, I'm going to think this way, I'm the politician, and now when I'm at my church, I'm going to be the preacher. We're all one and the same. And so our ethics, our character shows up together, both as politician and preacher.
So, DeMett, let me ask you a little bit then about your role with the museum with the International African American Museum, and how does religion play a role in the stories you're trying to tell there?
So in my role as Director of Education and Engagement for Faith Communities, I am I'm tasked to do three things. One, I'm to help bring awareness of this wonderful museum that we're building and to talk about the consciousness of the site where we're building this museum, where our ancestors literally stepped foot on the ground when they got off of those ships. So that's one, to bring their awareness of the work that we're going to do to tell the untold stories of African and African American people. So that's the first task. And then to make sure that we are connecting with all of our faith communities around the world, nationally and internationally, so that that we can be doing programs with them. We want to have programs like this, talking about faith and religion of all faith traditions, all religions, all cultures. We want to delve into various conversations and topics of conversation. And so my role is to make worldwide connections, to make sure that people know who we are and the work that we're doing here in Charleston, and to make sure that these untold stories get told around the world. So it's a hard job, and it's a wonderful position. And what we're talking about, how I enter into these doors. That's not always an easy thing to do. And I know we haven't begun to talk about our role as women and my role as women in the spiritual world. But, just being able to knock on those doors and have those doors open for me can be, very welcoming and sometimes not.
Well, so DeMett, that's a great setup for me. Thank you. It's a great setup for where I want to go, because as we talk about race and religion, I think we would be remiss not to talk about questions of gender. And even though I'm starting the question with you, I wanted to be really cautious that I'm not equating gender as synonymous with women, right? I mean, I am gendered as well. And so can you speak a little bit about the role of women in the church, within chaplaincy, the cultural programming, which you've already hinted at. And then I would invite our other co-panelists, Youssef and Yossi, please to chime in as well about gender, the role of women in your communities, and how that functions. So,
yeah.
Please.
When I shared earlier that I grew up in a very small rural United Methodist church, and in my growing up, there was a woman, we had a woman associate pastor. So I grew up always seeing a woman in the pulpit, a woman preaching, a woman in leadership. And so it just was normal for me to know that a woman would be a part of the pulpit and part of the clergy team. It wasn't until I graduated from college and moved to North Carolina and I joined a Baptist church. And that particular Baptist church was a very progressive Baptist church. It was women on the pulpit as well and in leadership. But at the time, when you are becoming a minister in the Baptist church, the process is you become licensed first, and then you become ordained. And in the licensing process, I had a friend who was becoming a licensed minister, and her father would not attend her service because he did not believe in women in ministry. And he was basing that on the scripture of 1 Timothy 2, where Paul says, that women should be quiet and just be dressed nice and not be in leadership. So even though that was his daughter, he had no support for her in becoming a minister because he said it wasn't biblical. And so he was not going to attend, and he did not attend. And it was very surprising to me at that time because I saw women all of my life in the pulpit and in leadership. So I was appalled by it. I thought, what is this? This is his daughter. He's not coming to his daughter's licensing service. But that's when I learned that wasn't uncommon. It wasn't uncommon. And I was very naive to that because that wasn't my life experience. But what I learned then is that, there are people who firmly believe that women do not belong in the pulpit. And my other experience was when my sister was getting married and the pastor She wanted me to co-facilitate, officiate the service, and he said to me that I could not do that. And the only thing that he said that I could do was I could read the Our Father's Prayer. Well, for those of us who know about the Black church and the Black wedding, you don't read the Our Father's Prayer at a wedding. That gets sung. That gets sung at the service. And so he said to me, well, you could read it like somebody would sing it if you want to do that, because that's the only place that you would have to, only part you would have to play in this wedding. And so he made it very clear to me, I don't accept you. You're not going to be a part of any leadership or co-officiating. And the best I could do is you could read the Our Father's Prayer. So it's a smack in the face. You know, it looked me right in my face and said, you know, as hard as I have worked and all that I have done, I feel called to ministry, I've been ordained for ministry. And for this person to say to me, absolutely not, you're not going to participate in this and you're not going to lead. It's a very hard thing to experience. And it's not uncommon, unfortunately.
Thank you, DeMett, for sharing those stories so honestly and giving us some insight as to what's at stake for so many people. Yossi, can I invite you to respond to offer your thoughts on this question as well?
Yes, sure. So I think some background to this would be helpful, which is what's interesting is if you look at the first Jews arriving in Charleston, which is 1665, I think. And then the establishment of a synagogue, which is in 1749, right? So there's a large gap between Jews arriving and a synagogue being founded. If you look at Charleston, which is the holy city because of the steeples and the churches, and the houses of worship, it almost seems like that worship is very much connected, or church worship is very much connected with faith. And with Judaism, it isn't really that way. What's important to Judaism is faith really is the bedrock of faith is taught in the home. And Judaism is a religion which is practiced in our home. It's rituals which are practiced together with the family. And perhaps that's why Jews have been able to survive even in spite of all the oppression throughout the years, where they've been robbed of liberty, sometimes religious liberty, sometimes both liberties together. And the survival of Jews has been because the core of Jewish tradition has been practicing Judaism in the home. So with that being said, within liberal Judaism, yes, there is male and female leadership positions within the synagogue in equally. But within more traditional Judaism, there are very different roles for male and for female. So what we like to say is that different but equal. So, for example, lineage in traditional Judaism is passed by the mother. A Jewish mother with a non-Jewish father, the child is Jewish. But if a Jewish father with a non-Jewish mother in traditional Judaism, the child isn't Jewish, because because the teaching, the way religion was passed down, happened in the home, where the mothers were much more influential. Plus, within mystical Judaism, the feminine soul is much more powerful. It has the ability to affect another soul, where the masculine soul doesn't have. And so that's got to do with, is where some of the difference is. So there is gender equality within Judaism, and even within traditional Judaism, but recognizing that the roles of male and females are very different when it comes to religion.
Thank you, Yossi. Youssef?
Yeah, so this is a complicated answer. What's not complicated is the reality that women, particularly women in Black religious communities, run those communities, right? And they are responsible for their success. I mean, if you look at any Black religious community, whether it be a Christian community, a Muslim community, etc., right? The health and the efficacy and the vibrancy of that community is hinged upon the presence of women and the ways in which the women in those communities make everything that the community does possible. Now, depending on what Muslim communities we're talking about, right? The presence of women, or the experiences, I should say, of women can be very different, right? In certain communities that are more matriarchal, or rather, patriarchal, right? The women can feel very unwelcome, can be made to feel very unwelcome. In some of the communities that, most of the communities that I feel comfortable in, women are made to feel quite welcome, according to what I've seen, right? I'm not a woman, so I can't speak on behalf of women or, that sort of thing. But as someone who is married and has daughters, right, I'm quite intentional about what communities, what spaces I expose my daughters to, right? For me, right, you have some people who believe that women should be silent and should play the background and this sort of thing. That is not how I understand my faith. I don't agree, right, that women should be made to feel silent and these sorts of things, right? I want my daughters, which is sort of where I begin in certain contexts, to think about the world I want to be in, the world I want to see for myself and for them, and for my loved ones in general. What are the kinds of communities? What kinds of community that I want them to be a part of? What kinds of communities I want to contribute to? So I don't want to paint a rosy picture about the experiences of women, the role of women, the historical legacy of how women are treated and how they are made to feel in Muslim communities. I'll also recognize that Muslim communities aren't monolithic, and also recognizing that I don't want to sort of speak on behalf of Muslim communities. I realize that there's a kind of sort of nature to which we're kind of doing that in this space, but yeah, I mean, there are certain mosques that I may not go to depending on whether or not my daughters are with me, just because, most of the communities that I sort of know people in and travel in, I'm close to people in many communities because of my personality and et cetera. But there are certain communities that I would feel less than comfortable having those who are women in my family sort of attend regularly. Now, I'm actually working on a book about a Muslim community of African descent, primarily African descent, in Moncks Corner, South Carolina, which is about 35 minutes driving distance northwest of Charleston. The Muslim community of Moncks Corner, Masjid al-Muhajirin wal-Ansar, which is predominantly a Sufi community, right? In which the sort of, I guess you could say, the cultural center emanates out of a sort of a West African, a Senegalese context. And women are cherished and held up and recognized for their contributions. The roles are gendered, right? As in most, if not all, Muslim communities, at least to some degree, right? We have to acknowledge. But it's one in which I feel proud to consider myself sort of part of. But yeah, I mean, this is a I guess you could say this is a long conversation that I'm going to go ahead and be quiet now because I feel like I'm rambling. But there's no easy answer to this question, is my point.
No, there's not. And I think that's the point that...
And there's work to do, yeah.
And there's work to do. And I think that's the point that I think all three of you have spoken so well too, is that we cannot speak to a Jewish experience, we cannot speak to a Christian experience, we cannot speak to a Muslim experience. We can speak to a variety of experiences, and where we are as individuals is the only experience to which we can speak to with authority. And Youssef, as you said, you think it's more welcoming to women, but you're not a woman, so you don't yourself know. And I think that's an important caveat and an important boundary for all of us to make, is that these conversations should be opening. They should make these conversations more difficult. They should make these conversations more complex. They shouldn't provide us with answers, but they should provide us avenues of thinking. And I think that's where the comparative element here, or I should say comparative, but hearing from so many different voices is so useful, because it does give us that roughness that keeps us from making smooth understandings, but really saying, always questioning what we know, how we know it, and why we know it, right? Which I think is always an important part of being an informed citizen, and also being just aware of the world around us and being engaged in the world around us. We are
if I could just add something else. I just want to acknowledge that my sisters in the ministry, are still suffering from not being able to adhere to their calling. Some of them have been called to pastor and called to serve in leadership, and they are part of ministries that won't allow that. And so sometimes it's a struggle because people have history at that particular faith house or that within that community, and they don't want to leave, but yet not leaving does not allow them to be who they've been called to be. So it's still very prevalent, and unfortunately, and asked me earlier just about the chaplaincy. There are more women chaplains than there are male chaplains. Mm-hmm. And so within the healthcare system, the women are highly regarded and highly respected. And I very seldom, as when I worked as a chaplain, had anybody ever, not want me to enter into the room or not want me to be, because we're considered pastors of the healthcare, the units that you're assigned to. That's your parish, because we just like no different than the pastor who delivers a sermon every week and has Bible study and outreach activities. We are that same people within that healthcare system. And so, we are that to those employees and to those patients and to those family members. But the women certainly rise in healthcare in terms of functioning as pastors and chaplains. It's just in our faith communities outside of that's still a struggle.
Great. Thank you so much, DeMett. And I think that brings me to another large question for the group as you're talking about what this means and the struggles that your sisters in ministry are going through, is that I started this conversation talking about religious liberty. And I think what you're talking about is, what does liberty look like within a tradition rather than from outside a tradition? And so looking to the future, looking to a year out, 5 years out, a decade out, whatever time frame works for you, could you speak a little bit, and I'll just go back in the order we started. So Yossi, I'll start with you on this question, is what does a realization of religious liberty look like for you?
So if you think about it, there are 7 billion people in the world today, and there are 12 million Jews, 6 million in Israel. There's 13 million Jews, 6 million in Israel, 6 million in the United States, and 1 million elsewhere. So that you have just 7 million Jews outside of their native, outside of their native habitat. So in a way, Jews are more endangered than the spotted owl. So there needs to be a realization that when it comes to Judaism, that in order to preserve it, we need to make sure that those traditions are kept strong. And we need to make sure that we provide all those opportunities to allow Judaism to flourish and to thrive. And being a minority faith, and I know this is sometimes, I like to say this idea of being a minority faith, but truly being a minority faith is something which Jews come to terms with and need to understand how to grow with that. Teach our children that all religions have value, and one religion doesn't make someone more important than having another religion, and that we can practice our faith. There are multiple pathways to the divine. And there isn't just one way. It's not my religion is right and your religion is wrong, but every single soul is calibrated differently. And each soul needs a particular discipline in order for that soul to access its spiritual mission.
Thank you. Youssef.
Yeah, so as far as how do we realize religious liberty and what does that look like to me, I think, as I've alluded to earlier, the realization of religious liberty is tied up in the realization of liberty more broadly, in my mind at least. Only when we as a society can develop a genuine commitment to equitable life for as many people as possible, and when we can move our understanding of liberty beyond individual liberties, and when we can commit to ourselves to a sincere concern for our fellow humans, can we even begin to think about religious liberty? Often in many communities, there are congregations, right, that have agreed to participate in interfaith dialogue, for example. But I'm not so sure dialogue is the answer. And that's not to say that dialogue is not productive, but those instances in which it stops at dialogue, I think it would be more effective or more impactful for such communities to be resolved to participate in interfaith action, right? Beyond, asking somebody why they wear the headscarf, or asking, what a yarmulke is, or asking, what's somebody's favorite verse in the Bible is, and what does it mean to them, right? Beyond sort of ironing out differences, right? Which sort of is kind of an exercise in navel gazing. I think it's important to think about how we sort of build the worlds in which we live in an intentional fashion, right? Mm-hmm. And this may seem too simple, but this sort of reframing could, I guess, potentially resituate our collective priorities away from understanding and tolerance and gesture and apologetics, toward actually improving the collective living conditions of people within our respective communities and beyond.
So it's not just care in theory, but it's care in practice.
Exactly.
DeMett.
Yeah, so religious liberty for me is it's a freedom of faith and beliefs. So, and what I mean by that is, I'm a believer in God, and so I don't necessarily define myself as Christian. I define myself as a believer. And if I can just be a believer, then I can believe in quite a few things. For me, just being a Christian says that I have to believe these particular things, that I don't have another thought, I don't have another way of seeing it or another way of experiencing it. So as a believer, I can choose what's important for me, what I want to believe and what I want to support and how I want it to live and operate. And so religious liberties to me means that freedom of belief and freedom to think about what is important and who is important and why that's important for me. And not to be grouped into a category. And that's why chaplaincy works so well for me, because I'm able to engage people of different traditions and faiths and walk into that space with them, and they walk in the space with me.
Perfect. Thank you, DeMett. Yes, I just want to come back to you quickly, because I think Youssef and DeMett answered a question I didn't ask, but in a very good way, which was, how do we build intentional community? And I think both of them have spoken to that a little bit. So I'd invite you to just, if you wouldn't mind taking a couple of minutes to share your thoughts.
Yeah, so I think religion is really the foundation for creating intentional community. This idea that every single person is created in God, every single person is created in the divine image, and what animates a person is that fragment of the divine which is embedded within them. And if we recognize that, and recognizing that each of our prospective traditions inspires us to look beyond the person and to look at how we are similar versus how we are different, to look not to focus on the clothing or the exterior of each individual person or their circumstances or their position, but to recognize that everybody is divine handiwork. That is the foundation for creating intention. It's a different way of thinking. It's about allowing us to look at people differently and encouraging us to view people in a different light.
Yeah, intentional community for me is having transparent conversation, be willing to be vulnerable in those conversations, and really truly removing the elephant out of the room so that we can have honest, sincere conversations. I think at times that we are afraid to say how we grew up or what was taught to us or the messages that we heard that may be different from other people, because that's a reflection. It may feel like a reflection on ourselves or a reflection on our families. But I think if we can just say what that is and talk through those things, then we can have an intentional community about what our differences are. You know, this is how I thought about this. And that came from, you know, the way I grew up or what my father said or what my grandparents had told me. Like, we've got to start by having those true, honest conversations so that we can really get to a place and not even say to folks that when we're talking, yes, I see that you're Jewish. Yes, I see that you're Muslim. Yes, I see that you're a person that of faith. Yes, I see that you're Black. Yes, I see that you're Asian. Like, we're afraid to say that that's who we are. I'm a Black woman. You can say that I'm a Black woman. Don't say to me you don't see my color, because then that's a whole nother conversation. You know, you have to see my color. I see your color, but that doesn't mean I have to treat you different because I see it. I want to be recognized and I want to be acknowledged the same way I want you to do that. So I think if we could just begin to have some true, honest, vulnerable, elephant out the room conversations, we can have an intentional community.
Yeah, I think as an educator and somebody at the universities, you know, teaches at a number of different universities around New York City, and who often works with Muslim students, I'm always struck, and I think this comes back to this question of race and religion, because I think Muslims are racialized, right? They're not a race, but they're treated as a race. So, as Youssef said, you know, the largest number of Muslims in this country racially are Black, not South Asian, not Arab. But, you know, I was teaching in New York, and I'm still teaching in New York, but when it broke that the NYPD was profiling people based on their religion, right? So that raises the question for me about First Amendment protections of religion. How could the NYPD choose to profile people based on their religion? How do they go about doing it? And what did it mean for my students who were afraid to go pray, who were afraid to take part in community on campus, which for some of them was the only community they had? Or a student at one school, Fordham, this is all public record, who was pressured to spy on his friends in order to avoid being arrested on a pot charge, right? And so thinking again about the ways as we think about intentional community, what are the biases that are being brought into these questions of intentional community? Who is forming these communities? And Yossi, you talked about marginalized communities, religious communities, but I think DeMett, you've also hinted at marginalized racial communities, right? And the ways in which there is a lift expected of marginalized communities that, in addition to being marginalized, they have to justify why they shouldn't be marginalized. And I think about the ways in which those things intersect with one another, and how sometimes the intentional community coming from a marginalized group may have the best of intentions, but there's sometimes insurmountable obstacles to having those conversations and those engagements. And I don't know if that necessitates a response, but obviously any reflections from you are always welcome.
I was wondering if I could sort of offer a quick comment and just kind of circle back to Omar ibn Saeed. And I'm going to try to sort of fold this into sort of prior comments that were made. So a prior question sort of focused on religious conversion, right? One of the things that I wanted to sort of offer was, rather than think about or focus on religious conversion, I think it's perhaps more meaningful to focus on religious ideology. Or rather, perhaps we should understand Omar ibn Said's life story, as well as sort of a broader, in this case, African-American religious history, through the theological force that animated abolitionism and concerns for justice, right? And as you know, Reverend Jenkins alluded, if not outright said, right, a kind of a theology of liberation, right, in which God, regardless of from what path one prays, right, is the God of mercy, of justice, the God of all in existence, right? Reverend Jenkins, you used a very important word that sort of popped out to me not too long ago, was this idea of the believer, right? In the Islamic tradition, and actually, Abrahamic tradition more broadly, right? That being Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, right? There is this idea of belief is not untethered from action, right? If you say you believe, then do, right? In a kind of way. And so I think it's incumbent upon us, for those of us who profess belief, who profess faith, to act, to find ways to build community, to find ways to fashion more sort of equitable configurations of life. Yes, we won't necessarily eradicate the presence of marginalization or certain kinds of oppression, perhaps. But the purpose, perhaps, is not necessarily to eradicate, but rather to attempt, to try, to work. At least this is how I understand the call or the task that we're given as believers, right?
Thank you, Youssef. We are, of course, open to questions from the audience as well. So as they start coming in and we start organizing them on the back end, I would like to ask you, and again, you're always welcome to come back, as Youssef has done, to come back to anything else we've spoken about. But again, as we began our conversation, this has been an extended period of social justice action across the country. And thinking about how your own communities reacted to some of these movements and demonstrations in Charleston and Durham. And I'll open it to whoever wants to go first and jump in on that. DeMett, I think you're on mute.
Okay, I'm so sorry. When we had the protests this past summer, I knew that things were happening downtown Charleston. I happened to be watching the news, and I saw the reporter sort of riding up King Street and kind of showing us the destruction of some of the buildings, and realized they were near my family's businesses. And he didn't go that far up, but he was on the next block up. So I figured, well, if he was that close, I probably need to go down there and see what happened to our buildings. And sure enough, when I went down there, all of the glass had been broken. Even the person who was renting the space from us had gotten injured as well. And so it was disheartening to see the devastation that happened on King Street, and all of these businesses had gotten destroyed. At the same time, I understood the anger. I understood the frustration of whomever the people were, whether they were Black people, white people, whomever was upset about what was happening at the time. And I believe that was when we witnessed the killing of George Floyd. It divided our city, I think, even more. I think Charleston is still a city that has not come together in harmony as much as we like to think we have. I grew up here, so, King Street up until Calhoun Street, we didn't go across Calhoun Street. You sort of knew that was the dividing line. You didn't go over that direction. And so to see King Street not be the Black King Street that I grew up on, and to also see these businesses destroyed was disheartening. But my heart was tossed, because as angry as I was that all of these folks were going to have to suffer financially because of the destruction of their buildings, I understood the pot had boiled over for people. Mm. And it was very hard to not be angry and demonstrate your frustration.
And I agree with everything that DeMett has just said. Just one thing to add. probably the most dangerous time to be on King Street was Sunday morning, when there were hundreds, if not thousands, of people brandishing shovels and brooms to clean up King Street. People who probably never held a broom before in their life. And it was really heartwarming to see that, yes, the night before there's terrible destruction. And most people who know people in Charleston, everybody knows someone whose business was decimated, and which was a tragedy that it got to that point. But you see the city coming together. That's when you really saw Charleston. You saw Charleston the next morning, where as soon as light broke at 6 o'clock in the morning, hundreds and hundreds of people going all the way through till 10 o'clock, fighting over a shard of glass to see if they could help clean up.
I guess I can offer my reflections. So I guess I'm a kind of an outlier here amongst the three of us respondents, because I don't live in Charleston, even though I know it somewhat intimately. I currently live in Durham, North Carolina, for those folks who are watching. But actually, many Muslim communities were forced to look more closely at how they participate in forms of anti-Blackness. And some have, to varying degrees, committed themselves to thinking about how they can be more equitable going forward. And this is sort of radiated outward to sort of questions about gender, et cetera. Of course, more work has to be done. But the communities that I'm affiliated with tend to focus more on providing material aid where needed. There are people who participated in protests as individuals, right? Who were part of the sort of larger demonstration, but not necessarily as congregations, right? Black Muslim communities, as they have always done, have been involved, but more can be done in the way of participating in matters of social justice. And I think that's true, or that rings true for every community. There's more I could say, but I'll stop there.
So I had, speaking of building community, my experience was over the summer. I was living on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, which, for those of you who are unaware, is a fairly homogenous community, racially, religiously. And they were doing nightly vigils it was called the Black Lives Matter Vigil nightly. And I went and made a sign where I quoted a verse from the Quran. It was actually chapter 8, verse 46 for George Floyd, which is do not give up. I'm paraphrasing here, which is do not give up your patience, for it is the power you have to turn your condition. And it felt very appropriate. And I'd written underneath the Quran. And people afterwards came up to me and gave me salams. They were other Muslims who were in the neighborhood who didn't know that there were other Muslims in the neighborhood. And you saw sort of like people then bringing signs with verses from the Quran on it. Stand for justice even against yourself, another very well-known verse for justice. God will not change the condition of a people unless they change it for themselves. And so you saw then people coming in probably with a religious sensibility, but being conditioned not to express it. And then once you open that dam, how that religion starts occupying that space as well, which means the scholar of religion was fascinating, but as somebody who is also religious in this space, finding that community, not through religious institutions, but finding religious community through social activism, right? And finding that space in that community. So that's sort of been my experience with how this year has played out in terms of religion for me. I think with that, I invite you all to give closing thoughts. Otherwise, we can end for the evening. Then please, I want to thank all of you so much for being with here tonight, sharing your wisdom, your knowledge, your depth of feeling for the topics that we've covered today, inspiring all of us, inspiring me to go out and look at something in more and new and in exciting ways, and to build that intentional community, to think about the society in which we live in and the call to do something to make it better and to realize the promise that is there, if not the reality that has existed so far. And we have another event for those of you who are in the audience. Thank you for joining us and giving us your time this evening. There is another event coming up on February 9th on spirituality in the Low Country. So we hope to see you then as well. Thank you all again, and have a good night. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rashid.